In the last 12 months, the New York Times has written 2,969 articles on Ukraine. Nothing wrong with that. It has, by contrast, though, run 54 articles about the Congo, knowing well that since more than 30 years multiple wars take place there that already killed around 3 million people and displaced 7 million. Pretty much the same with Sudan, where even 12 million people are displaced. Honestly, not much coverage. Or is it not much interest? Or does one just come with the other? Anyways, the Western media obviously gives disproportionately rarely screen time to news from Africa, be it good news or bad news. And what good and bad news are sometimes also differ depending on the perspective, Western or the African. For example, Burkina Faso decided to nationalize its gold mines, as it already did with its sugar sector as well as a bank. Same with Niger, which recently revoked the French uranium mining company Orano's license, and the country also nationalized its water sector from the French company Veolia. Those are big news, amazing for these countries, probably not so great for the French companies though. It's a trend that also the other Western countries are observing with worries. What do these African countries have in common? Burkina Faso and Niger. They are both in West Africa, and together with Mali they are part of a new bloc, which is called the Alliance of Sahel States, or short AES. They announced their formation in September 2023 and just had their first summit in July 2024. Wait. A new alliance? Aren't there already enough with the African Union, the ECOWAS, etc.? Why a new one? And for what exactly? Let's take a look at the AES. Why the need for a new alliance? What does the new formation mean for the future of West and actually all of Africa? Is another alliance not just one more step into further fragmentation and polarization of Africa? Or is it the opposite, a new Pan-African project? The change movement that is taking place in West Africa in the last years was to be expected, because every 30 years a young African generation rises up and demands real change. As in 1960, when Europe vacated the colonial empires, or in the 1990s, when the people questioned the old elites and finally got rid of the apartheid system in the south of the continent. And now. Check out my other video about history of French colonialism in West Africa for a closer look into the past, because that explains what is happening right now. The recent change movement is this time happening in the form of military coups. 10 coups since 2020 took place in West and Central Africa. They even call this the coup belt now. And as some of the new governments have the same goal, which is to take the control back from the European and American powers over their own resources and key sectors of the economy, and to join forces in the fight against terrorism, they decided to unite. At first, let's look at the coups of the 3 AES countries. It all started 4 years ago in Mali. Then President Keita was detained by a group of Malian soldiers after protests from the people that called on him to resign. A military government wasn't planned at first, another civilian was to take over, this one, but he decided to sideline the military forces that led the coup, and they reacted with another coup. Colonel Assimi Goïta then took over. In Burkina Faso, the current situation is also the result of a coup within a coup. In 2022, Lieutenant Colonel Damiba led a coup against the civilian government of President Kabora after growing anti-French sentiment in the country. Damiba, however, also couldn't hold his position and was overthrown by a group of soldiers led by the then 34-year-old Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The third in the alliance is Niger. It is now over a year ago that President Mohamed Bazoum was detained by top army officials led by the Chief Presidential Guard General Abdourahmane Chiani. That coup in Niger nearly caused a new big war on the continent, because at the insistence of France, the Economic Community of West African States, short ECOWAS, was threatening military intervention in Niger if the leaders of the coup did not immediately relinquish power and free President Bazoum. Mali and Burkina Faso announced in return that they would militarily defend Niger in case of an ECOWAS invasion, and even though all 15 ECOWAS countries, except for Cape Verde, committed troops, no one actually wanted an escalation. Many people living in the border region of Nigeria and Niger were protesting to keep the decision-makers from starting a West African war. Fortunately, no war started, but the old order was gone for good. And the positions between the military juntas and the ECOWAS countries hardened. And when I say old order, I mean it figuratively and literally. Look at them. Many African countries, not only the ones in West Africa, are ruled or were ruled by either old men who were extending their rule more and more, or by family clans, which are just handing power to the next generation. But the problem is not only these gerontocracies. Sometimes it may even work. It's more in the way that they are also part of the old order. The old order is the rules-based international order imposed by the big players, be it West or East. that has not served Africa's interest in the past. The old order African leaders are perceived as puppets of foreign powers who are selling their own countries and people to receive money and privileges in return. More and more people in Africa and generally in the global south are refusing to accept this liberal order because it only caused them suffering in the past. So the putschists in West Africa are promising change. They promise to not align with anyone, neither the West nor the East. If you'd ask them, they would never say they are pro-Western. But they would also refuse to say they are pro-Russian or pro-Chinese. They would always say they are pro-African. This pro-African means they choose their alliances not by force or by trust, but rather by themselves first of all and by the advantages they receive. It's a very pragmatic approach, focusing on one's own interests and avoiding being drawn into a geopolitical entanglement as much as possible is the only realistic survival strategy for these countries. A great example to show this new pragmatic pro-African approach is the Alliance of Sahel States as a military alliance. That's why they decided to unite in the first place in September 2023. The AES as a new defense pact makes very much sense first of all, because many African countries that were colonized by France have a very weak military. This is a historical relic, part of the colonial legacy in these countries. This was always intentional, by the way. It is this endemic weakness which justifies the assistance and defense agreements with the French and other Western forces. Which is also kind of ironic because most of the conflicts in these countries stem from the chaos that spawned after NATO's interventions. For example, in Libya, Islamist terrorism has taken root across the Sahel region, affecting Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. Also, the illegal invasions of Iraq and Syria stoked violent extremist movements, including Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, which have since spread like a virus across whole Africa. The result is that these countries are very much occupied in fighting terrorism that the Western interventions caused, and for that they need military assistance. The AES decided to chase the French, German and American soldiers out of their countries. The three members decided for some kind of unity in isolation strategy and joined forces in their fight against terrorism. But what especially the US annoys the most in leaving their new and expensive base is that they will be taken over by a new partner. And that is, drumroll please, Russia. Everyone remembers the Wagner Group, I suppose. Since its head, Yevgeny Prigozhin, had this accident, it got quiet around this paramilitary company. They still exist though. They were just rebranded in Africa as Africa Corps and are now directed by a Russian military intelligence unit. The Russian forces have one significant advantage over the US's, whose military is legally barred from supporting governments that seized power through coup. I know, that sounds absurd considering all the coups supported by the US throughout history. Maybe someone can explain this to me sometime. Russia doesn't have these constraints. Like China, they follow a non-interventionist policy, which means they partner up with you, no questions asked. Maybe a bit of diamond and gold mining contracts in exchange, but besides that, no strings attached. Anyways, you may now say, but why a new alliance? There was already the G5 Sahel, no? Yes, but as this cooperation between Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali and Niger was heavily dependent on external support, especially from France, the junta countries announced their exit. So G5 Sahel is gone. But what about ECOWAS? Yes, this union still exists, but the junta countries decided to exit because they want more sovereignty over their own decisions. ECOWAS is backed up by the UN, the EU, the USA, and the AES members have new partners, as I said, like Russia, but also Turkey and especially China in terms of business and investments. A little side note on this. The China-Africa Summit 2024 just finished last week, and looking at the numbers, it's pretty clear that the days of a strong Western influence in Africa are counted. The thing is, the AES decision makers are not dumb. They don't go for Russia, China and Turkey because they love them so much or because they trust them. It's business. And they just have better offers at the moment. It's nothing personal. The same, by the way, with the African Union, where the AES members are suspended from. Unlike the European Union, the AU doesn't have supranational powers, meaning it can't make decisions that are binding for member states. It also doesn't provide a single market or common currency as the euro. So the AU can't do anything about the issues between the ECOWAS and AES except asking for dialogue. And here we come to our last point for today and the question if the new alliance can be seen as a pan-African project, or is it not just doing more harm by further fragmenting and dividing Africa? At the first look, it seems like the division between ECOWAS and AES is a showstopper for the pan-African dream. But let's look on the bigger scale. A strong and united Africa relies on the solidarity between the countries, but in this century especially, unity needs to be achieved through economic development and resource sovereignty. In Niger, for example, the people didn't forget that France exploited uranium over decades for their own electricity, while in Niger itself not even 20% of the population had access to electricity in 2023. The hope is that with the decision-making power over these resources and also with a new big partner like China, progress can finally be achieved in a faster and much bigger scale. The African Union has many projects in its Agenda 2063, which aims for the socio-economic transformation of the whole continent. Every African country is part of the AU, and within the Agenda 2063, Africa can achieve more and more Pan-African projects, like a common currency, a standby force, kind of like an African NATO, which would then probably be called SATO, or an African passport, transnational rail networks, etc. The AES members are not blocking these projects. They only favor new partners, and they don't want to be restricted by the old order. So for now, we can't really say whether the AES is a unifying or dividing alliance. The future will show. The suspension from the EU is a problem though. It would be important for the African Union to not let the AES members go. And let's go on a bigger scale again, which is the UN. Something has changed here. According to the non-profit International Peace Institute, more than half of Security Council meetings and 70% of Security Council resolutions with Chapter 7 mandates, those authorizing peacekeepers to use force, concern African security issues. Yet there are no African countries among the Security Council's 5 permanent members who are empowered to veto any resolution. This injustice is something many African leaders of the past tried to change. All the African countries, plus progressive countries that can function as allies, have to put a charter review conference on the agenda to finally change this outdated rule. And this is only possible if the African countries stay in dialogue with each other. So hopes are high for this new alliance. This can be a new dawn for West Africa and for whole Africa. Worst case, it turns out to be another military dictatorship, as seen many times before. The juntas in Mali and Burkina Faso already announced to push elections further to the future. That may be because many countries lost their hope in a Western type of democracy, and in times of crisis, governments tend to rule in an autocratic manner. Let's just hope for unity, progress and stability. Thank you so much for watching. Tell me your opinion about this and what topic you'd like to see next. And as always, consider liking and subscribing.